It was a peaceful evening as Rachel Carter adjusted the rearview mirror in her sleek black SUV. The hum of the freeway slowly faded away as she turned onto a quieter road, heading towards the suburban outskirts of Denver. The cool night air drifted in, and the soft glow of streetlights illuminated her red cocktail dress, which she had worn to a charity gala for a children's hospital she had long supported. The event had been meaningful, but Rachel's heart was set on the comfort of home, on being reunited with her two kids and spending a peaceful evening with her husband. Little did she know, her night was about to take an unexpected turn. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was her husband, Daniel Carter, Denver's newly appointed chief of police. Rachel couldn't help but smile at the thought of him. Home in a bit, she whispered to herself, deciding against answering his call. Then the flash of red and blue lights illuminated the rearview mirror, a police cruiser. Rachel's brow furrowed as she slowed her SUV, pulling off onto the shoulder of the quiet suburban road. Her mind raced for an explanation. She hadn't been speeding. No signs had been ignored. She wasn't distracted by her phone. Maybe it's a routine stop, she thought, rolling down her window as the officer approached. The officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp gaze, didn't waste any time. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. Rachel handed over her documents, her fingers feeling stiff, though she tried to remain composed. "Good evening, officer," she said with a calm tone, though a flicker of unease crept in. "Can I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer glanced at her license before meeting her eyes, his voice cold. "We received a report about a vehicle matching this description being involved in suspicious activity in the area." Rachel's pulse quickened. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady as the words seemed to hang in the cool night air. "Step out of the car, ma'am," the officer ordered, his tone growing more rigid. Rachel hesitated. "Excuse me?" she said, trying to grasp what was happening. "I'm not sure I understand." "Step out of the car. Now," he barked, the command sharp and unmistakable. Rachel's heart rate spiked as the sound of another cruiser's engine grew louder. Two more officers emerged, their flashlights cutting through the dark, their eyes scanning the scene. Her hand trembled as she unbuckled her seatbelt, her breath catching. She opened the door carefully, keeping her hands in clear sight just as Daniel had always reminded her to do in situations like these. "I'm complying," Rachel said, her voice calm but steady. "But I'd like to know why I'm being treated like this." Her calmness seemed to agitate the officers even more. One of them immediately began searching her SUV without asking for permission, rifling through the back seat and the trunk. The other just stood nearby, their eyes fixed on her every movement. Rachel's heart raced. This wasn't right. She had nothing to hide, but the way they were treating her like she was guilty of something was both confusing and humiliating. But Rachel wasn't the kind of person to cower. "I'd like to call my husband," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. One officer scoffed. "You can do that after we're done here." Rachel's jaw clenched, but she kept quiet. She didn't want to escalate the situation. Instead, she silently hoped that someone would step in, that this nightmare would end before it spiraled out of control. But she had no idea how quickly things were about to escalate. Rachel stood by her car, the cold night air biting at her arms as she watched the officers dig through her belongings. Her meticulously organized trunk filled with boxes of event materials from the charity gala was being treated like a crime scene. They pulled out item after item, inspecting them with exaggerated care, as if they might uncover something criminal. One officer held up a stack of brochures, his eyes narrowing. "What's all this for?" Rachel's voice remained steady, her patience thinning. "I just left a charity gala." "Those are brochures for a children's hospital we're raising funds for." The officer stared at her, his face unreadable, before tossing the stack back into the trunk without a word. The second officer, a younger man, who seemed nervous, moved closer to her. "Ma'am, are there any weapons, drugs, or anything illegal in this vehicle?" he asked. "No, officer," Rachel replied, her patience on the edge. I told you I haven't done anything wrong. I would really appreciate an explanation as to why I'm being treated this way." Her calm demeanor only seemed to irritate them more. "We're just doing our job," the older officer barked, slamming the trunk shut. Rachel glanced at her phone, still sitting on the passenger seat, buzzing again with an incoming call from Daniel. "Can I retrieve my phone to call my husband now?" she asked, keeping her tone steady but firm. The officers exchanged a quick look, their faces unreadable. "No sudden movements," one of them said, as though she were a danger to them. Rachel fought the urge to scoff but nodded, carefully reaching into the car to grab her phone. The officers seemed almost disappointed when nothing about her behavior gave them reason to feel threatened. But they weren't finished. "We're running your plates and license," one officer muttered, stepping away. Rachel crossed her arms, the cool breeze brushing against her skin as the second cruiser's spotlight bathed her SUV in harsh light. The intensity of their scrutiny, the unwarranted assumptions, it felt like an invasion of her dignity. It was infuriating. But Rachel kept her composure, knowing that any sign of anger could be used against her, potentially escalating the situation even more. With calm hands, she dialed Daniel's number. He picked up almost instantly. "Rachel, are you okay? I've been calling." She cut him off, her voice tight with a mix of frustration and urgency. "Daniel, I've been pulled over by the police, and they're searching my vehicle without cause. I need you here, now." There was a shift in his tone, immediately concern and authority intertwining as he responded. "Where are you? I'm coming." Rachel gave Daniel her location, her voice wavering ever so slightly as the gravity of the situation began to settle over her. "Please hurry." As she ended the call, she felt the officer's gaze intensify, their body language stiffening. They didn't know who she had called, but something about her calm confidence seemed to unnerve them. Minutes stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Rachel remained silent, standing tall despite the humiliation, her eyes scanning the darkened road. She noticed a few cars slowing down, their drivers craning their necks to see what was happening. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but she refused to shrink. Then she heard the sound of a car pulling up. A sleek black SUV came to a stop just a few yards away, its engine purring before it fell silent. The driver's door swung open. Daniel stepped out, his tall figure cutting through the night with undeniable authority. His face was a mask of restrained anger, his usual calm replaced by something much more intense. But what happened next was something neither Rachel nor the officers could have predicted. Daniel Carter wasn't the type of man to lose his temper easily. Years of experience as a public servant and, most recently, as chief of police had taught him the value of control, especially in tense situations. He knew when to remain composed and when to act decisively. But tonight, seeing his wife standing on the side of the road, surrounded by officers, her posture defiant despite the unease in her eyes, something inside him snapped. He closed the door with a firm thud, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet night. The officers glanced at him, their expressions guarded, but the shock in their eyes was unmistakable. They hadn't expected someone of his presence to show up. Daniel was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his police badge gleaming on his belt under the streetlights. The badge was a symbol of authority, but also one of a man who had worked tirelessly for the safety and well-being of his community. "Good evening," Daniel said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "I'm Daniel Carter, Chief of Police in Denver. Can someone explain to me why my wife is being detained and her vehicle searched without cause?" The older officer, clearly the one in charge, straightened his posture but avoided Daniel's gaze. "Sir, we're conducting an investigation. We received a report of suspicious activity involving a car matching this description." Daniel's jaw tightened, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. Suspicious activity in an SUV, driven by a well-dressed woman coming from a charity event. "You do realize you're speaking to Rachel Carter, my wife?" The younger officer shifted, clearly uncomfortable, glancing toward his partner for support. The older officer cleared his throat, unwilling to meet Daniel's gaze. "We weren't aware of her identity, sir. We were just following protocol. Protocol? Daniel's voice rose slightly, a controlled fire simmering underneath. Since when does protocol involve searching someone's car without their consent or probable cause? Did she give you permission to do this? That's what I thought, Daniel said, stepping closer. His presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. The officers, once steady, seemed uncertain, their rigid posture faltering in the face of his command. Bystanders had started to gather, some already holding up their phones, recording the scene. The red and blue lights flashing behind Rachel's SUV bathed the gathering in an eerie glow, adding to the tension. Rachel finally spoke, her voice unwavering despite everything. Daniel, they wouldn't even let me make a phone call at first. They've been treating me like a criminal from the moment they pulled me over. Daniel turned to Rachel, his expression softening for a brief moment before hardening once more as he faced the officers. Do you have any idea what kind of liability you're exposing this department to? He asked, his voice low but filled with authority. You're harassing an innocent citizen, my wife, no less, without justification. This isn't just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. One of the officers, clearly feeling the pressure, stammered, his words faltering. We were just doing our job, sir. You didn't mean. Daniel cut him off, his voice sharp as a blade. Your actions speak louder than your words. And those cameras, he gestured toward the growing crowd of bystanders, their phones held up to record the scene, will ensure there's no spinning this later. You're going to explain yourselves. Right here, right now. The officers exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. The older officer took a step forward, trying to regain some semblance of control over the situation. Chief Carter, we'll need to de-escalate the situation. Perhaps we can discuss this back at the precinct. Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh, his eyes narrowing. De-escalate? You want to de-escalate now? After humiliating my wife and violating her rights? No, we're addressing this here, in public, exactly where you created this mess. By now, the crowd had grown significantly. People were murmuring in disbelief, some shaking their heads, others recording the confrontation with wide eyes. Rachel stood quietly, her posture composed, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she was feeling. Call your supervisor, Daniel ordered, his tone unwavering. Now. The older officer hesitated for a moment, his resolve crumbling under the weight of Daniel's presence. Reluctantly, he reached for his radio, his movements stiff and defeated. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of accountability pressing down on the officers as they awaited the arrival of their superior, the growing crowd watching, waiting for what would happen next. But what happened when the supervisor arrived would turn this already tense situation into a breaking point for everyone involved. The faint crackle of the police radio pierced the thick silence as the older officer called for his supervisor. The minutes that followed felt like hours, Malcolm standing resolute, Rachel silently watching, and the crowd growing larger by the second. Some bystanders murmured quietly among themselves, while others whispered into their phones or live-streamed the entire scene. Finally, a black and white SUV pulled up, and out stepped Lieutenant Charles Donovan. His uniform was sharp and crisp, the gold badge glinting in the streetlight. But his expression, one of annoyance mixed with confusion, betrayed the pressure of the moment as he approached the group. What's going on here? Donovan demanded, his eyes scanning the scene. He barely glanced at Rachel before turning to Daniel, his attention now fully on the man who stood at the center of the storm. Lieutenant Donovan, Daniel said, his voice even and unwavering. Your officers here pulled over my wife, conducted an unwarranted search of her vehicle, and have failed to provide any legitimate reason for their actions. I'm waiting for an explanation. Donovan's eyes widened as the reality of the situation settled in. Commissioner Carter, I didn't realize. That's the problem, Lieutenant. Daniel cut him off, his tone firm but composed. It shouldn't matter who she is. Every citizen deserves respect and fair treatment. And this is anything but. The lieutenant's face tightened as he turned to the officers, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. Is this true? Did you search her vehicle without cause? The older officer hesitated, his gaze flickering nervously between Daniel and his partner before he finally spoke. "We had a report about suspicious activity." "Cut the excuses," Daniel interjected, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "You had no cause, none. And now, not only have you harassed an innocent woman, but you've also put this entire department under scrutiny. Do you even understand the gravity of what you've done?" Donovan rubbed his temple, clearly fighting to keep control of the situation, but it was slipping through his fingers. "Chief, I assure you, this will be investigated thoroughly. I'll handle it personally." Daniel stepped forward, his presence unwavering, every word steeped in authority. "This isn't just about an investigation, it's about accountability. You don't get to sweep this under the rug, not this time." The crowd, once hushed, began to murmur in agreement, their phones recording every word, every shift in the scene. The pressure was building, and the officers could feel it. Daniel turned to the growing crowd, his voice rising as he addressed them directly. "To everyone here," he said, his words carrying weight, "this is the kind of behavior we've been fighting to eliminate in our police force. No one, no matter their status, their job, or their skin color, should have to endure this kind of treatment. This is why accountability matters." A smattering of applause rippled through the crowd, some people clapping, others nodding in agreement. Rachel watched her husband, her heart swelling with pride, despite the exhaustion that had settled deep within her. But Donovan, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the moment, shifted his stance. "Chief, perhaps we can move this conversation somewhere private." "No," Daniel said firmly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Transparency happens here, in front of the people you serve. Your officers need to understand that there are consequences for their actions. If they don't, nothing will ever change." The officers shifted uncomfortably under the unrelenting pressure, their earlier confidence unraveling with each passing second. Donovan struggled to respond, but it was clear the balance of power had shifted. There was no escaping the consequences of what had unfolded, and the truth was inescapable. But the story didn't end there. The fallout from that night would spark a chain of events that no one, especially the officers involved, could have anticipated. The fallout was swift and unrelenting. By the next morning, video recordings of the confrontation had gone viral, shared across social media platforms with hashtags like #JusticeForRachel and #AccountabilityMatters. News outlets quickly picked up the story, airing the footage alongside headlines questioning the integrity of the Denver Police Department. The video, capturing every moment of the public standoff, painted a stark picture of a systemic issue many had long known, but few had dared to confront. Rachel and Daniel sat side by side at their dining table, the early morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Rachel, still exhausted from the previous night, sipped her coffee while Daniel scrolled through his phone, reading the growing stream of articles and comments. "They're calling it the Carter incident," Daniel said, his tone heavier than usual. "I knew it would get attention, but this it's bigger than I expected." Rachel set her cup down gently and looked at him, her expression steady, despite the weight of the situation. "It's not about us, Daniel," she said, her voice firm. "It's about what this represents, how many people go through this every day and don't have the platform we do. They deserve justice too." Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting the gravity of her words. "I've spent my entire career trying to root out this kind of behavior," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "And now it's clear there's so much more to do." Later that day, an emergency press conference was held. Daniel stood at the podium, flanked by Rachel and other members of the department's leadership team. The room was filled with reporters, cameras flashing, and community members watching closely. His voice was calm but resolute as he addressed the crowd. "What happened last night was unacceptable," he began, his tone carrying the weight of both his position and his personal conviction. "The actions of those officers were not just a violation of policy, but a betrayal of the trust that this community places in its police force." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room, making sure every person in the crowd understood the gravity of the moment. "I want to be clear, this is not who we are, and this is not who we will be." He let his words hang in the air, allowing them to sink in. The room was silent, hanging on every syllable, knowing this moment was the beginning of something much larger than any single incident. There will be a full and transparent investigation into the incident. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. But this isn't just about disciplinary action, it's about systemic change. Daniel's voice rang clear and unwavering as he stood in front of the podium, facing the press and the community. We need to ask ourselves why incidents like this continue to happen and what we, as leaders and as a society, are going to do about it. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of support washing over him. But Daniel's face remained serious, his eyes focused on the task at hand. He wasn't done yet. He turned to Rachel, who stepped forward, ready to share her experience with the world. The crowd quieted, hanging on her every word. "When I was pulled over last night," Rachel began, her voice steady, though the weight of her emotions lingered beneath the surface. "I felt powerless. I did everything right, followed every instruction. But it didn't matter." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "I wasn't seen as a person. I was seen as a problem to be dealt with. And I know I'm not alone in feeling that way." The room was silent, everyone feeling the gravity of her words. But I also know that change is possible. It starts with accountability, with people speaking out, and with leaders like my husband who are willing to challenge the system from within. We have to do better, for everyone. The crowd was moved, many visibly affected by her powerful message. Applause erupted once again, but this time, it wasn't just about support, it was about hope. Hope that things could be different in the days that followed. The department launched new training initiatives focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. A citizens' advisory board was formed to ensure transparency and accountability within the force. These changes, while only a start, were a step in the right direction. Daniel personally reached out to community leaders, promising to rebuild trust and make the changes that had been long overdue. He knew that repairing the rift would take time, but he was committed to the work. As for the officers involved in the incident, they faced disciplinary action. One chose to resign rather than face the consequences. Their actions served as a painful reminder of how deep the systemic issues ran, but also how necessary it was to confront them head-on. As for Rachel, she became an advocate for justice. She used her platform to amplify the voices of those who couldn't speak for themselves, advocating for transparency, reform, and fairness in law enforcement. She often told her story not out of anger, but out of hope. Hope for a future where no one would have to go through what she did, where every citizen would be treated with dignity and respect. "It's not just about what happened to me," Rachel would say, her voice steady and resolute. "It's about what we do to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." In the end, the Carter family turned a moment of injustice into a powerful catalyst for change. It wasn't easy. The road ahead was long and filled with challenges. But they faced it together with courage, conviction, and an unwavering belief that a better world was possible. Daniel, as the chief of police, knew this was just the beginning. Rachel, as a passionate advocate for justice, knew the fight was far from over. But in that moment, standing side by side, they knew they were on the right path. And that's the lesson we all need to take away. Real change starts with accountability and the courage to stand up for what's right even when it's uncomfortable. So ask yourself, what can you do to make a difference? Start today. Speak up. Push for change, because every voice matters.